Professor, when it comes to like the Kalām tradition, um, I guess we can say that there are like what I've observed, there are like two sort of trends. One trend is, there's one group of scholars who would say that, they basically go back to the pre-colonial colonial times where Kalām was left off before the advent of modernity or let's say colonialism. They go back to the pre-colonial times or pre-modern times, and then they start basically resume the intellectual tradition. There's another set of Muslim scholars right now, another group, which basically argues that we should incorporate, modern advancements in philosophy and let's say mathematics and logic and physics, for example, quantum mechanics, and we should incorporate that like with our indigenous disciplines or intellectual trends. How would you situate yourself between like those two trends, if they make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I would, of course, ideally like the latter, because
Uh,
the person conversant, deeply conversant with their tradition, also able to navigate uh, contemporary disciplines, I suppose is the ideal form um, of citizen. Um, but I wonder how that will be accomplished. So I don't have an answer. That is the ideal, because you see, discursive systems have their own integrity. So if you read, for example, legal theory in Islam, you very likely better have read at least a little bit of literary theory in the Islamic tradition. And to understand aspects of literary theory, you have to have access to other disciplines like logic. And so it becomes difficult for me to imagine how a contained tradition, discursive, continuous tradition, where would be the fissures and openings within that tradition in a meaningful, organic way to integrate contemporary discourses. They must be. It has to be done carefully. The other way is to go to the first option you gave, which is to recognize and study deeply the structured whole of the Islamic discursive tradition, and then also study the structured whole of the Western contributions to knowledge, and recognize that their assumptions and historical developments are different, but not necessarily let one of them become predominant in relation to the other. So that's another mode of knowing, I suppose. So anyway, that's my unsatisfactory answer to your question.
Yeah, there was one recent article that I read. It's written by Professor Raymond Harvey. So he has done work on Al-Maturidi. So there's this article. It talks about basically he takes Al-Maturidi and McIntyre, and he basically talks about how, for example, liberalism and Islam on the topic of justice, how they can converse with one another, they can engage. The two traditions can engage with one another in dialectically. So I guess since we are living in modernity and we have to deal with the intellectual trends in the Western world, I guess it's sort of I think it's sort of inevitable that that our systems of thoughts will be affected by they are actually affected by the intellectual developments that are happening in Western world.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And on this, I do have a very clear position, and which also shows itself in my book. And I think Professor Harvey does it in the way that it should be done, I think. So the position is the following. You can either have a paradigm of engaging Western theory, whereby you study deeply those works, those theoretical works, understand their frameworks, and then apply them as some kind of a universal theory to Muslim texts and traditions. And I think that would do violence to the Islamic tradition, because of course there's their own underlying theories and frameworks that are embedded within the Muslim text that must first be extracted by the close reading of those texts, right? So, for example, reading the idea of authorship or originality or genius through the lens of Harold Bloom on the Islamic tradition would really miss the point of how Muslim pre-modern traditions thought of authorship, continuity of voices, synchronicity of voices, and so on. So that's one way of doing it. I think that's problematic. The other way of doing it is to read the Western tradition as robustly as you would read anything else, to understand it and have mastery of it, and then put it on the side, leave it for a minute, and then read the text of the Islamic tradition very deeply, and try to understand what their underlying theories and frameworks of operation might be. And at the end of that day, what you would end up doing is that you would take the latter theories that you have extracted from the Muslim texts and put them in conversation with theories that you have read from the Western tradition, and recognizing and realizing that the latter, the Western tradition theoretical model, is not a universal model. It's not a model that can be grafted onto all kinds of texts from other traditions. In fact, you de-universalize it by empowering the textual traditions that you're reading by extracting their own theories. I think that's the right way of doing things, right? So, and it actually accomplishes both things. You would get an understanding and mastery of other traditions, but you would also recognize that those traditions that claim to be universalizing are actually grounded in specific texts and periods and traditions. And you would give authority and a certain kind of independent space to your own traditions by making them speak theoretically on a par with the Western tradition. So I think that kind of work is very fruitful.
Right.